Okay, good evening. That is good evening to the Eastern Standard, Daylight Saving Time, Standard Time, whatever. But I know there's some people listening on the web that for them it's afternoon, and there are others morning, and there's others night, and so on. So I don't want to limit this. We live in a world today where what you say here is heard there. So one has to be very careful what you say. That's the bottom line. I welcome you all. Simon Jacobson is my name. And we shall talk about wealth. The wealth after the fire. There's an expression from our holy masters. They say, Mipi Kedoshei Elyon, from the mouth of the cosmic holy masters, who said that, anyone knows Yiddish here? Anyone speaks Yiddish? Anocha Sreife wird man reich, which means after a fire, one becomes wealthy. This was said by many great tzaddikim, many great rebbes, to people who had suffered actual fires, God forbid, in their homes, or in their businesses, or in other situations, that after a fire one becomes wealthy. And the reason for that is based on the Kabbalistic sequence of the spheres. If you're familiar with the 10 Sfirot, some of you may be familiar through my book on the counting of the Omer. There's the 7 emotional attributes. So they begin with Chesed, Gvura, and Tiferet. There's 7, but the first 3 are Chesed is love and kindness, Gvura is severity and fire, and the third is Tiferet, which is wealth, prosperity, beauty. So in that order, you'd say that first the person begins with having blessings in their life, Chesed, love. Then there's Gvura, which is the opposite extreme, the antithesis, severity. Gvura literally means strength, but it also refers to severity, severe judgments, din, discipline, as well as fire is attributed with Gvura, water is attributed with Chesed. And then after Gvura, so after a fire, after being ravaged severely, comes Tiferet, which is wealth. That's the basis of this idea. Why is it relevant to us today? So I thought of it as a connection with the fact that this past Tuesday, the fires consumed the temple 1,943 years ago. That's the Romans. And 490 years before that, the Babylonians, the same day on Tisha B'Av, the 9th day of Av, the saddest day in the Jewish calendar, was the destruction of the first temple. So both temples, exactly the same day, exactly the same place, were burned down, first by the Babylonians and then by the Romans. Until this day, we have essentially, the embers are left. And you go to look at the Temple Mount today, it's a desolate space with trees growing. There is one structure built right in the Holy of Holies. It has a golden dome. And it was built obviously as a demonstration of humiliation and to show that the Muslims conquered the holiest spot. So there are fires that burned there that till this day we remember. And we mourn and grieve over them. And we have one wall that's left, one remnant that's left from the whole destruction, which is the Western Wall, the Kotel HaMaravi, the Wailing Wall it's called at times. One remaining wall. If you ever go to the tunnels tour under the temple, if you take the tunnels, you can see how much more is still there. Actually, the wall, as we see it, is only one little percentage of what still remains underground, because Jerusalem really was built a city on top of a city, maybe even a city on top of a city on top of a city. And you can see the remnants that are there, and it's pretty huge. You can even see, some of the tour guides point out, the place where the Romans tried to destroy any memory of the wall, because Herod, when he built the temple, the second temple, what he did was, because it was on a mountain, he built this type of man-made artificial plateau. I forgot what it's called in architecture. It's like on a mountain you create something that's flat, so you could have a solid foundation. And you can see parts of it are still there, but you could also see that they tried to destroy it, but they couldn't, they didn't have the time or they didn't have the patience and technology to get all the way down to the bottom of it. So you could see where they tried to destroy any remnant that one day people could deny that there was once a temple here. You could see it very clearly in the tunnels beneath. So the fires ravaged this place. And we're still here to talk about it, almost 2,000 years later. So if that's not wealth that follows fires, I don't know what is. So we have a vivid example of prosperity. And I find prosperity not necessarily in the financial sense, but prosperity in the sense of eternal survival. Who would have believed almost 2,000 years ago when the Romans exiled all the Jews out of Israel? And we went on our long transmigration first, whether it was to the east and the eastern countries or to the north, to the western countries. And finally here we're sitting in New York, and to talk about and still sit Shiva, we still mourn and grieve over those flames. So to say that this isn't a miracle, after all those fires, that we're here to talk about it, would be quite, what's the word for it, obnoxious. But it's not just survival, it's a lot deeper than that. There's an actual statement from the Arizal. The holy Arizal, Rabbi Isaac Luria, who lived in the 15th century. In the 15th century, he talks about Tisha B'Av, and he says that Tisha B'Av afternoon, Mincha service, the afternoon service, we say a special prayer. Only once a year we say it. It's called Nachem. Nachem means be consoled. Like when this Shabbos, Nachemu, which I will speak about soon. So Nachem. And in Nachem we basically talk about the consolation for all that we've suffered, and that one day we will rebuild again. So the Rizal says the following: why do we say Nachem? Tisha B'Av afternoon, even though that was the worst time. Because even though Tisha B'Av begins the night before, the worst time was Shabbat, was the afternoon, because that's when the flames were burning at their highest. And continued on till the afternoon afterwards, the 10th of Av, that's why till noontime, the next day, though it's not Tisha B'Av any longer, it's still considered to be somewhat, because the flames were still burning till around noon. And they lit it all up in flames. So he says, because in the throes of the suffering, in the throes of these flames was born something. Mashiach was born, the Messiah, redemption, was born right in the middle of those flames. So you have here a perfect example how fire at the same time also gives birth to something, which in itself is the ultimate paradox. Because when we psychologically think of loss, and who in this world has not been burned or hurt in some way, whether physically, emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, our psyches in many ways are wounded. Different experiences in life. It could be experiences in our childhood experiences. It could be the wounds we carry from different losses in our family, dysfunctional lives, and of course losses in relationship. And by the time a person is around, I would say age 30, usually have experienced some type of some fire. If not, great, count your blessings, and hopefully it stays that way. But life has all its curveballs. Everybody's got their challenges. So we usually think in terms, therefore, that when there's a loss, and at best you grow from it. But to say that in the fire is born healing, that's not something you hear that often. So in therapy and healing and in all kinds of type of rehab or growth after loss, basically the focus is that how to not allow the loss to haunt your life, and learn how to grow through the process. But to say that in the loss itself really lies the birth of growth, that is not such a common statement, and it needs a lot of explanation. So I want to discuss that. So it's not just about something that comes later; it's actually born in the moment. Now that doesn't mean we have the eyes to see it. The fact is, when the temple was burning down, it's not like anyone, even with the best eyes, could suddenly say, "Hey, I celebrate rebuilding." Even Rabbi Akiva, who I spoke about, I believe, last week, who laughed when he saw the desolation on the Temple Mount. and he saw the fox running out of the Holy of Holies. While his colleagues all were crying and grieving, he began to laugh. So the Talmud says, why? Because his colleagues, they saw the prophecy of destruction. And he saw that the prophecy of destruction would one day lead to the next stage of rebuilding. And as a result, he laughed. But even Rabbi Akiva, let's be honest, sat Shivas, cried, and grieved on Tisha B'Av. There's no question that he did not celebrate on Tisha B'Av, even though he was able to have the vision of seeing something bigger and greater. So this is part of the theme I would like to discuss. And of course, it's also connected, as I said, to Shabbos Nachamu. So those of you not familiar with what that is, let me just clarify. We are now, Tisha B'Av comes at the end of the 9 days, which concludes the end of the 3 weeks. So there's a Talmud that talks about the Haftarahs. The Haftarah is that reading that we read from the prophets after the Torah reading on Shabbat. On Shabbos we read from the Haftarah. And at the end of the Haftarahs generally follow the sequence, follow the themes of the Parsha. Every Parsha has its corresponding Haftarah theme. Except the Talmud says 10 weeks. Which 10 weeks? Actually 12 weeks. I should correct myself, 12 weeks. Which 12 weeks? So Talmud says this expression, Talasa de Paranisa, this is in Aramaic. 3 of retribution, 7 Shiva de Nechemta, 7 of consolation, and Tarta de Tiyufta, 2 of Tshuva. What is it referring to? It's referring to that the 3 weeks, beginning the Shabbos, that begins the 3 weeks, those 3 weeks, the Haftarahs are not the theme of the chapter. They are the theme of the time. The time then commemorates the destruction of the temple. So 3 weeks is retribution, basically 3 very sad prophecies about how the destruction will happen. Then days are followed. Those 3 weeks ended this past Shabbos. Last Shabbos was a third of the 3 of the retribution. Then comes the next 7. Beginning this Shabbos, this coming Shabbos will be the Shiva de Nechemta, the 7 of consolation, starting with the first one is Nachamu, Nachamu Ami, where the prophet says, be consoled, my nation. So this begins a 7-step process of consolation, which every week will be another Haftarah on the theme of consolation, not on the theme of the chapter. And that will conclude the Shabbos before Rosh Hashanah. So now we have 7 Shabbos before Rosh Hashanah. The 7th will be before Rosh Hashanah. Then the Talmud says 2 more, 2 of Tshuva. One, the Shabbos between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, it's called Shabbos Shuvah. So there the theme is Tshuva. And then there's always another Shabbos before Sukkot, depending on the schedule, but there's always 2. Sukkot is the 15th of the month, so there's always 2 Shabbos between Rosh Hashanah and Sukkot. But that theme is also on Tshuva. So we have 3, they call it pain, destruction, 7 consolation, and 2 return. That's the process. So we're now in the week of the first one of consolation. So clearly, it's the same idea that after the loss begins the consolation, begins the journey. So the first thing that needs to be stated right at the outset is the most obvious statement that everyone knows, but we constantly have to be reminded of this, that life is not a straight line. Just like, God forbid, if a cardiogram showed a straight line, we would not consider that to be very healthy. Sometimes straight lines are good, and sometimes they're not. They're good, maybe when you need to find the shortest route between 2 points, the straight line is the best way to go, so you don't have to get lost and not waste your time. But if you want to have an image and a picture of life, it is a cycle. So a good cardiogram, a healthy one, looks like that, like a wave, and hopefully very equal. The crests and the dips are direct proportion to each other, hopefully without any hitches. That's a healthy heart. And healthy breath is exactly the same way. You want to exhale and inhale in exact same proportion, without one overwhelming the other. That's the cycle of life, even on a most basic physical level. And the same thing is emotionally and psychologically life is not a straight line. So why is this important to state, even though it's so obvious? Because when we are in the dip, we'd rather be in the crest. Nobody wants to go through downturns. But if you go into life knowing that there will be a healthy balance of what we call rotzei and shuv, yearning and returning, or tension and resolution, and you accept that beforehand, then you go in like a wise swimmer, knowing when you swim the waters, know beforehand that the waters will not be stable all the time. There will be times when they're calm, and there will be times when they're stormy. And if you're wise and you prepare well, you prepare in the times of calm for the times of the storms, and during the storms, you know not to fight the waves, you know to float, you know to go with the flow, instead of fighting it. Now, children who may not be so familiar or mature enough to understand this, the first time they experience disappointments, they go through difficulties. So they try to reach to a parent or to someone they love to find some type of answer, because they're not comfortable with a loss. Nobody's comfortable with losing, or with something that we see as a setback. Now, healthy parents, healthy educated, healthy mentors will help a child grow into understanding that this is not a bad thing. It's part of life cycles. Like anything, you need to have times where you rest and there are times you move. Look at the cycle of the week in the Jewish calendar. 6 days work, Shabbat, then comes Shabbos and Menucha. Because it's healthy for the human being to have a change of pace and to constantly be in high gear and never calming down, never going back to yourself. Not healthy emotionally or psychologically. So if you think about it that way, Shabbos happens to be very much aligned with the cycles of life. And this is true throughout our lifetimes in many different ways. Now, of course, the difficult part for us is the surprise element. We don't know where that next dip. When you're riding high, you're riding high, and when you don't know when it's going to start changing, but there will always be a change. And it's interesting; those people who are aware beforehand, the change is never as drastic as those that are caught by surprise. What was the brilliance of Joseph when he was appointed by Pharaoh to be the viceroy, the second in command in Egypt? Joseph had interpreted the dream that no one was able to interpret. The two dreams that Pharaoh had about the cows, the fat and the skinny cows, the thin cows, and then the fat and the rich and the plump and the narrow stalks. And he interpreted them, which is in retrospect sounds quite logical, that there will be 7 years of famine, preceded by 7 years of plenty. And that's where the thin cows swallow the fat cows. The famine ends up swallowing the prosperity. And then Joseph, after interpreting the dreams, and it resonated, it made so much sense, when it asked, so what should we do about this? So his answer was, in the years of plenty, stockpile the grain, so then when the famine will come, you'll have enough. Not just for yourself, but you could also sell it. And it became the commodity of its time, and it actually turned Egypt into a superpower. So what was so brilliant about this idea? Seems quite, if you accept and believe that there will be a famine coming, if you don't believe there's a famine, of course, but if you believe there's a famine coming and you know that you're going to have 7 years of plenty, it seems like a logical piece of the advice. And they all said, this brilliant young Jew, make him president, make him second in command. Well, the brilliance of Joseph was not just that the advice was that implementation. Why do we have this thing called forced savings? Because if we don't force it, if we don't do something, we psychologically, when things are going well, we do not prepare. We always say there's the next day, there's tomorrow, and so on. You see it all the time. We procrastinate, we push it off. When things aren't going well, yes, we suddenly wake up. When things are going well, we usually take it for granted. Joseph's brilliance was that he was able to create a plan, a strategy of discipline. Do not indulge, don't scrounge all the grain, which was so easy to do, but stockpile it, discipline, ration it, and so on. And because he was able to implement, that's what the brilliance was. Psychologically, this is even more difficult. When things are going well, it's usually almost impossible to really wake somebody up. Because they feel they're riding high, everything is going well. What do I need advice for? What do I need to prepare for famine? Maybe it won't come, maybe it won't be that bad. And if it does come, I'll deal with it then. There's many, many excuses we have. I mean, just look at yourselves, look at ourselves, and we see this all the time. And then, God forbid, when it strikes, and you haven't prepared, you start regretting and saying, I should have, and so on. So essentially, emotionally, we do not know how to look at prosperity in a way with humility. One of the most powerful statements in the Torah, which was stated by Yaakov, and later repeated similar thousands of years later by the Alter Rebbe when he came out of prison, was the expression "Kateinti mikol achsodim." I have become small. Kateinti from the word katan. I have become diminished. I have become humbled because of all your chsadim, because of all of your kindness. When Jacob, after 20 years, finally leaves Lavan with his family, and he's about to face his arch enemy, his twin brother, Esav, and he hears that Esav is marching with 400 men and ready to go to war, so Jacob prays to God and says, you have kateinti, I have become diminished, I have become humbled because of all your chesed. The power of that statement is because it was in good times. He was very prosperous. He was very successful. He built a beautiful family. And he still became humbled. Because it's so easy to become arrogant, or at least to feel entitled when things are going well, because you say, I deserved it all the time. That's why the Torah warns us that we should never, in times of success and prosperity, always remember, big warning, it's actually a prohibition. Never say, Keichi ve'etzim yodi asili esachai lazeh. That it's with my own strength and my own initiative that I was able to achieve all this. Know that this came from a higher strength. Yeah, you may have done some things right. You may have also avoided doing some things wrong. So it's not like there's no credit at all. But don't think it's just self-made. The biggest mistake a person can make. And often that is the downfall. That doesn't mean, God forbid, that a person will suffer because they feel that way. But it means when times are tough, what do you say then? Is that also self-made, or is that God's fault? In other words, if you're taking credit for the great successes, then you have to also blame yourself when things are not good. And that's also not healthy. But that's what happens. People will blame God when things are not going well, and they'll take credit themselves when things are going well. They call it, look at every insurance policy, it's an act of God that the insurance doesn't protect. The good things are not necessarily called acts of God. They would say the separation of church and state. How could you mix religion and business and stuff like that? But in every insurance policy, there's acts of God, a tornado, a volcano, earthquake, a hurricane, tropical storms. We all have it. And it always struck me interesting. Suddenly God is invoked. It's pretty cute. So basically, they joke the joke they tell about the priest and the imam and the Jewish rabbi, and they all talk about they're comparing notes, how they make appeals. So as I go, I'm trying to remind myself. Okay, so the priest says, well, what I tell my people is that they should throw up their money to as high as they want. I make a circle down below. Whatever falls in the circle goes to the church, and whatever's outside the circle they can keep. And the imam says, well, I make a bigger circle, so obviously more is kept. And what did the Jewish guy says? He doesn't make a circle. He says, you throw it up, whatever stays above is yours, and whatever comes down stays with the synagogue. So stays with God is whatever goes above. So the point is that to appreciate in times of success that wave that I just mentioned is hard to do. Even though, as I mentioned, the heartbeat is such that goes with that type of cycle, and you don't want to hear that the heart is always only going up. You want it to go down and come up again, like a real balanced cycle. So, but when it comes to our personal lives, we don't want to hear that. We'd like to just hear that it's like that. It's going straight up. but straight up is equivalent emotionally, psychologically. First of all, it's not true and it's not real. Second of all, it's not even healthy. It's not even healthy. It's healthy to have dips and crests, but it should be a balanced one. It's healthy to have a measure of tension, measure of resolution. We all dream, each of us, I'm sure, that you inherit, or if God gives you a gift of millions and millions of dollars. You never have to go to work again. You never have to worry about any bills. You can travel around the world, indulge in every pleasure that you like, and you'll never run out of money. It's a nice dream, right? I'm sure some of us have it. Maybe some of us are there already. Then why are you coming to this class? That's a good question. Okay. Right. Now, think about it. Would that be a blessing or wouldn't it be a blessing? So it's interesting that Judaism does not advocate poverty. It says wealth is a bracha, is a blessing. God says, you'll follow my ways, I will bless you with prosperity. Prosperity is a blessing. Ashirus is a blessing. So that's not the question. But is the way I just described the picture, the scenario, what's the problem with that? Well, there's no problem with the prosperity part. The problem is what happens to us. What happens to us if you would be in that situation and you have absolutely no need to earn and no need to work? Would you become a productive human being and spend your life helping others and becoming a spiritual, godly person? Or would you become arrogant and a sense of entitlement that I'm better than everyone else because I have it all? That's the question. So of course, every one of us, the immediate answer is, let God test me with it and then we'll worry about it. You know? And I bless you all that God should do that. But I have seen enough in my life of people coming to me who are exactly in that situation. I've met people like this. More than one. Almost to the last person, they live miserable lives. They think they can do anything they want. I know people that can do literally anything they want the rest of their lives. Nothing will run out. Even if they don't earn another penny, they have enough for 50 people. And you know, there's a certain point where you just can't even spend anymore. Again, it's something most of us just it's fantasy, but there are situations like that. There are people have been blessed with that. Down to the individual, most people like that are quite miserable. Now, externally, you may not see it. They may look perfect tan and perfect hairdo and clothing and everything seems put together, but emotionally, relationships, which is unfortunately the area where I get to see it. I don't see the bank part. I see the other side. It's pathetic. It's sad because you can't buy that. As a matter of fact, the gilded cage, as one person told me, so castrates you and so emasculates you that you can't even do anything about it. Because nobody wants to give up their gifts, which may be the only way that person could really become an adult. Now, it's one thing people who have earned their way. There are people who become very wealthy through earning. Someone earned it, they earned it, they have a certain element of that. I'm not saying that they are allowed to be arrogant, but there is an element of appreciating because they knew the hard work that went into it. But someone that inherits it without one sweat is usually extremely, extremely psychologically destructive. But we would all love it, obviously, because you're getting it all. But what would it do to a human being? Most cases it would destroy the human being unless a person had that statement that Jacob said, that would be humbled by all that blessing. But you need a God for that. You need something more powerful than money than that. If you worship God more than you worship money, then we can say there's some hope. And I'm not just saying worship God lip service. I'm talking about really having a God above your head. Something that's greater than all these possessions. And those that have that, they can achieve greatness. So I've digressed a bit, but I want to go back, since we're talking about wealth and fires and prosperity and so on. So the first thing I wanted to state was the cycle of life. So we all understand the cycle and the need for the cycle. But I was going to go a little further. It's one thing you could say, okay, if the cycle is a healthy cycle, it doesn't go high too high. It also doesn't dip too low. But what happens if it dips low? What happens if we do get wounded and we do get burned, and there is a fire in our hearts, souls, homes, what do we do then? So it's the opposite problem, not the problem that I've had too much prosperity and I don't know what to do with it. The other extreme, where the dip is so low that you feel real loss. Now, in many cases, this is not even up to us, not even our choice. Someone growing up, a child in a home that's an unhealthy home, an abusive home, a broken home, a dysfunctional home. A lot of synonyms for this word, unfortunately. It's just not the child's fault. Growing up in an environment, thrust into an environment, not at your choice, and have to enduring different type of wounds. People losing parents at a premature age. I mean, maybe it's never a mature age, but it's a big difference, a child losing a parent than an adult losing one. People suffering due to unhealthy parents and guardians and protectors. Both overt abuse, subtle abuse. I mean, the list goes on. Unfortunately, it's a very big list. And unfortunately, also, most of us are not immune to it. And if you've been protected, thank God. But we live in a world where there are a lot of wounds that we inherit, essentially. And by the time we're old enough to be able to start trying to take control of our lives, we're not coming on with a clean slate. We've been given a whole platter. And not necessarily a good platter. Now, of course, I have to acknowledge that there are those that were blessed and grew up in homes that were loving and nurturing and did give as much as possible. Nothing is perfect, but pretty good. So that's true too. But obviously I'm talking here about the fire. The fire. So if we have chesed in our lives, great. If a person has chesed and they never experienced gvura, they never had a real fire, a real negative experience, if such a thing is possible, throughout life. In childhood I could see that possible, chesed. But at some point everyone's going to have some gvura. And if it's a severe form of it, a severe fire, like the destruction of the temple, but psychologically in our own lives, some type of betrayal or abandonment that destroyed your temple, some type of hurt that compromised your holiness or your respect for holiness and sanctity, which is the equivalent of destruction of the temple, then what do you do? That's the big question here. So I might want to make it clear, I'm not here to discuss, which deserves its own discussion, if a discussion is possible even, of why bad things happen to good people. I'm not getting into now justifications, because I don't believe in justification or rationalization of pain. And it deserves, as I said, its own its own discussion. I've talked about it other times. I don't want to go there, because that is a whole other discussion of why. Ultimately, just briefly, I will say that Jews never ask why. They ask, what do you do about it? Why, you may never get an answer why. You'll never get an answer why the Holocaust happened, why certain children have to be born into homes that are horrible, and other children are born into beautiful homes. Why? Very difficult, maybe impossible to answer. Why? There's some things that are beyond the mysteries of God's plans are very difficult to understand. And as I've discussed many times, the why of pain is connected to the why of joy. Because if there was no life, there'd be no death. And if there was no happiness, there'd be no sadness. So if you're going to ask why, you have to really ask why there's life. Why is there birth? Why is there happiness? And then we could also ask why there's sadness. So that's not what I'd like to discuss here. That's not the scope of this discussion. Again, I qualify that by saying that it absolutely deserves to be discussed, but you just can't talk about everything at once. At least I can't. The limitations of the finite universe. And if I could, it wouldn't be probably legible to speak about two things at once. What we could speak about is what happens after the fire. You could sit and bitch about it, pardon the expression, and be bitter, and just say, why did it happen to me, and why did I deserve it, and I was such a good person, and what did I do wrong, etc. You could spend your time doing that. The question is where it's going to get you. Will it bring any resolution? Will it bring any resolve? Any absolution? Will you get anywhere? I submit you won't get very far, because basically what happens then, the pain and the loss continues to haunt you, and now instead of it being a wound, it haunts you in the sense of what Why did it happen to you? And that's what remains part of your psyche and usually paralyzes a person. What the Jews have mastered, and Tisha B'Av is a perfect example, is that everything is a catalyst for movement. So it's true we would prefer that the cycle be an even one, and the dips and the crests, what do they call it, crests and dips, or is there another word for it? Peaks and valleys, okay. Peaks, ebb and flow, good. These are all correct. So we would prefer that the ebb and flow, the peaks and valleys, the crests and the dips should be equal, even. But if it does, for whatever reason, go down, so yes, option number one is, as I said, just to be bitter about it and say, why? Which only keeps you down there, and probably keeps you even more than you should stay, because you're now consumed with why and trying to figure out who's to blame or your own guilt, etc. A second option, which should be mentioned, is just ignoring it and making believe it's not there. And the third option, which is the option I would say the Jewish people chose as a whole and individually, was, I don't know why, but I'm down here now and I got to figure out how to get out of here. And I have to figure out not only how to get out of here, but how to use this downturn to be a springboard to get to a greater place than I was before. Because that's the ultimate redemption. The ultimate redemption is that there's no such thing as just going down and staying there, or going down and going back to where you started. Because then it would have been a loss. You have to get back to a higher place. The concept that you hear about in Hasidic thought, Yerida Tzerech Aliyah, that every dip, every Yerida, every descent has to be for a greater ascent. And the truth is, the first descent of all, at least in our lives, was when our souls came down to this earth. And the soul did not want to come. It was against its will. Al karcha chatachai. The Pirkei Avos says it was forced to come. Al karcha chatachai. But the soul was compelled to come down, because why did the soul not want to go? Because up there, so to speak, in the spiritual realm, it's warm, it's bright, it's comfortable. It doesn't have to deal with all the pains and sorrows and cruelty of this world. It doesn't have to eat, sleep, illness, death, loss, and so on. It's an equilibrium, a spiritual equilibrium, spiritual paradise. So the soul doesn't want to leave. And that's why one of the Hasidic writings, they write, one of the reasons a baby cries when it comes out of its mother's womb is not only to grasp the first breath of oxygen in its lungs, but a baby cries because it sees the world that's closing and the world that's opening. It sees the beautiful world it came from, and it's the last glimpse it has of studying the entire Torah in its mother's womb and the spiritual world that it's traveled through to get here, and now sees for the first time, comes out of its mother's womb. Of course, it sees the doctor, the nurse. I don't know what else the baby sees, but let's put it this way: no matter how good the doctor and nurse, it's not the spiritual environment that the baby came from. And a baby cries. That's the first tears. And then, what's even sadder is the baby stops crying, because now it's part of this reality, and no longer can see that, so it doesn't cry that often. But then, throughout our lives, we will cry. There are times where we cry because we stubbed our toe, but there's also crying for our existential loneliness, existential pain. Just a sense that this world is like something missing. Sometimes you can sense it, sometimes you can relate it, sometimes we don't even understand why. You suddenly start crying for no particular reason. That's the soul that's reminding you this is not your natural place. But the soul does come down here. Why? Because there's something to be achieved here that the soul can never achieve up there. Up, I mean not physically up, but I mean spiritually up, a more spiritual, evolved environment. What the soul achieves here is earning its way. The soul achieves here is overcoming obstacles. So the pain itself actually is the part of the growth. The soul understands that. We don't. Because you see, when you're traveling on this cycle, you don't really see the big picture. The reason we relate to the cardiogram is because we're outsiders. We're not on the path. We're looking at it, and this is my heart. And, it better be a good balanced cycle here. But imagine you were traveling on this, what do we call it? The peaks and the valleys. And while you're in the valley, you don't know where it's supposed to be going, because you're not looking at it from the outside. You're there. And when you're there, you only have a myopic view. You only see the moment. And the moment is painful. You see, the soul, when it cries, it always knows the bigger picture. That's why it agrees to come down to earth. It still has to be forced, because it's not the best place, most comfortable place to be. But the soul knows there's a bigger picture, and it's patient. And it's patient. But the body, and our body line, and our body vision, meaning our material eyes, don't see it. We live for the moment. Very hard for a material person to see a bigger picture. We see the bigger picture when we let the soul in. So to be able to see a bigger picture requires a whole different perspective. So is it pain or is it not pain? Is it a fire or is it a rebirth? Is it prosperity, wealth, or is it a fire? The answer is that it's both. That during the moment that it's a fire, it's an actual fire. But within it lies great power. We don't have the vision, nor should we necessarily have the vision to see that power, but we have to see it through until it emerges. They tell the analogy, one of the analogies given for this was, there was this great king who was in love with clothing, and he had all different types of garments. And he would commission tailors from across his kingdom to knit and sew for him beautiful garments, embroiderers. Now, there was one particular Jew in the kingdom who was an exceptional tailor. And obviously, as usually goes with his stories, there's also always an anti-Semite in the king's, advisory panel. And was always looking for an opportunity to find a way to instigate the king against the Jews. But this tailor had made the king many beautiful garments, so he was the king's favorite. So this priest, anti-Semite, came up with an idea. He said to the king, since he's probably the best tailor in your kingdom, why don't you have him make something that surpasses anything that you've ever been prepared, ever been sewn for you, ever been created for you garment. And he had a plan in mind. He knew, he was wise, he knew that if you sew something like that, it's going to have to require a lot of very expensive materials. And the king, of course, had no problem providing all of that. And then he had a plot. He concocted a plot. Now, what was the plot? You'll hear in a moment. So the guy was commissioned by the king, and he began to do his job. It would take a few years. And he finally came, and it was exquisite. Everybody could not believe what they were seeing. The king, of course, was extremely impressed. But here's where this guy had the plot. He says to the king, this Jew created, no question, we all agree it's the most beautiful garment. But how much did it cost you? And they started calculating. It was quite expensive. He says, let's measure this garment and see what happened if he used all the materials that you gave him. Now he knew that a good tailor is going to do something that's going to be difficult because it has all kinds of layers and folds and so on, that the king can be convinced that it's going to be hard to be accountable for every. So they measured it, and as well as they were able to measure it, it was less than what was given to the tailor. So of course the king became furious, and you all know the story how it goes here. The king decides to kill him. The day comes, but the tailor, before he's about to be killed, says to the king, I've been your loyal servant, I've made for you beautiful garments. Give me a few words to say before you kill me. The king says, fine. He says, it took me quite a few years to sew this garment. I guarantee you that if you let me take it all apart, and then you measure the materials, will be exactly the amount that you gave me. But obviously if you take it apart, it's going to take time, and also sewing it together may not ever be possible, because he could not be able to make it again quite that beautiful. The king thought about that, realized that makes a lot of sense. And this is the analogy given for a statement that it says in the Torah, that when the 10 martyrs that we read about in Yom Kippur were being killed, massacred by the Romans, so the angels came crying to God and said, Zu Torah v'zu schara. Rabbi Akiva was being torn apart with comb of metal, iron comb. This is Torah and this is its reward. And God responds the following words: Shteik kachala b'machshava, be silent. This is what arose in my will. And if you're not silent, I will destroy the entire universe. So people ask the question, okay, the first half makes sense. God is saying, be silent, you don't understand my bigger plan, and you have no right to come and challenge me. But why would God add that he's going to destroy the universe? Why would he have to destroy the universe? What's the point? And this analogy answers the question. He will destroy the universe, similar thing. If you want to understand why certain things happen, you need me to take apart the entire garment. And then that means the entire universe. And then you may be able to begin to understand. And obviously nobody wants that. So there's a element, when we look at it, it could be terrible. It's a fire burning. This isn't a justification, as I said. But it means we only have the vision of the final product. You want to understand, you want to see the deeper purpose, the growth, the ascent that comes after the descent, the wealth that comes from the fire, you have to then take apart all of existence. And that's something we're unable to do. We cannot see the bigger picture. So there's something in the bigger picture that tells us that this world, for all its challenges, contributes something to the soul, that the soul becomes greater for it. The soul can see it, we cannot. And we will never see it while we're in the throes of the problem. But that doesn't mean that we can't see it through and then see what emerges out of it. So, to clarify perfectly what I'm saying, this doesn't mean that every loss and every fire in our lives will be able to immediately appreciate and understand where it leads us. But there are many, many ways that right now each of us, no matter what it is that we went through, can see something greater. Now obviously while you're in the throes of the pain, while we're on Tisha B'Av, no one's asked us to start dancing and celebrating. It's not the day for it. Right now the fire is burning. But that's what it says, after a fire one becomes wealthy. One becomes wealthy because the liabilities can be turned into assets. The distress can be turned into strengths. And to use a few examples, I mentioned before that when there's a dip, when there's a valley, when a person draws back, you can use that energy to be a catalyst for something greater. So one of the examples given for it is the keshes, is the bow and arrow. The farther you want to shoot the arrow, the more you have to draw back the bow. The more you go back, the further you can shoot. The same is true in any type of situation. You want to jump ahead, you usually have to run back to be able to jump further. In every situation in life where you really want to achieve something greater than the usual, you have to do something unusual. So you need to create that type of tension that will be able to reach a lot further than should you just do it without any drawback. So in essence, you can say that when a person is in any situation of grief or difficulty, there is a certain energy there. The energy obviously is not a positive one, but it's still energy, or else you wouldn't feel anything. If we did not feel loss, if we did not feel pain, then that's one thing. But if we feel it, we actually feel it quite intensely. I would say that we probably feel more intensely pain than we feel joy. Some actually say you need two measures of happiness to cancel out one measure of sadness. If someone, for example, loses $1,000, you have to win $2,000 to be able to cancel that out. Meaning that winning 1,000 does not cancel out the loss of 1,000. That's how it is emotionally. That's what they say. So basically, for every tear you shed, you need to have 3 smiles or something like that. So every moment of sadness, you should at least triple, maybe more. The point being is that sadness is energy. Grief is energy. I speak about this on a personal level. I've said this many times. The closest thing that I experienced in grief in my life was the death of my father. My death of my father was, the loss of a parent is a serious, I would say maybe the most traumatic experience in a person's life. Maybe the most life-defining experience. More than, I have 2 children, I have a lot of other good things in my life, but that is probably the most impactful. Maybe because of the negative element is more powerful, as I said, than the positive. And don't get me wrong, having a child, marrying off a child, these are unbelievable joys. and I wish it upon everyone in the most powerful way. But, you really can't compare it. Loss, death is very, very profound. And to the point that it's completely overwhelming because of the finality, at least in our minds. You could have faith in Tchis HaMesim, you could have faith in the future, but at the moment it seems a finality that is impossible to fathom. And at the moment when you're in it, and I speak from my personal experience, and trust me, death of a father, he was 70 years old, my father, but I've seen people who've lost parents at much, much younger age, much more tragic circumstances. But loss is loss. To be very honest, if you lose your father at 100 years old, it's a tragedy. Not because it's not natural, but because it's the person that is part of your foundations of your life. And I mean father or mother, of course, in this context. So it's very profound, and it's impossible to even describe unless you were there. It's like a fire. It is a fire that consumes you. The days, I can go back there very easily to elicit exactly how I felt. Obviously, it's not the same intensity, but it's a fire that consumes you completely. And at the time, it's like completely overwhelming. The power of Shiva, when people come to visit, and visit someone that's sitting in grief, in mourning, it's very powerful because it's a way of lifting. It's a way of lifting you on the hands of others. It's almost like it pads you. It cushions the grief. It cushions the pain. Not that it takes it away. But I remember like someone telling me, when you lose someone close in your life, it's like a hole is cut out inside of your psyche, inside of your heart. And this hole never goes away. You start falling into it again and again and again. What happens with time, interestingly, is not that the hole goes away, is that you learn to stop falling into it. You learn to start walking around it. So think of a hole in your living room. Who wants a hole in your living room? But it's there. And you keep falling into it because you don't expect it to be there. And then one day, you start learning to walk around it. So it's still there forever. The interesting thing is what happens to this grief. It's such an intense power. The best equivalent I can give to it in physics would be a black hole. It's a black hole. So Einstein predicted the black hole, though he had no proof at the time. Then he actually retracted it. Until later it was proven to be right. What's a black hole? A black hole is a phenomenon that no one can actually see. But it's evident that there are certain spaces in outer space that there's something there that no one can see that's exerting a tremendously powerful gravitational pull because you see it affecting the orbits of all objects around that area. So imagine seeing, let's say, the moon orbiting perfectly, but you can't see the Earth. You have to say there's some force that's keeping this orbit. Imagine you see thousands of things orbiting around something, but you can't see the force. So the theory, no one understood what it was, but then they realized this was Einstein's theory, that the gravitational pull of this object is so intense, it doesn't even allow light to escape. That's why you can't see it. The sun emits light. Earth emits light. Not the same light like the sun, but you can see the Earth from the moon, you can see it from other planets, you can see planets. They emit a certain amount of light. So, because even though there's gravity on Earth, but the gravity is not that strong, that doesn't allow light to escape. Light is lighter than the gravitational pull. But there are stars, or black holes, that are so intense, it doesn't let even light escape. So where's the light going? It's imploding. It's going within. I remember first reading about it, it struck me, I was like blown away by it, not because of the physics, because it's exactly what it says in the Zohar in the beginning. In the beginning of the Zohar it says, there's a lamp of darkness. What's a lamp of darkness? It's a contradiction of terms. A lamp gives off light. How could it be a lamp of darkness? Call it darkness. Why is it a lamp? It's literally the same example, like a star. There's light, but it looks like darkness. Because what is the Zohar is alluding to when it says a lamp of darkness? So you look at the Eitz Chaim, which is the beginning of Arizal's writings, whose yahrzeit was last week, 5th of Iyar. I mentioned him earlier. He says in the beginning of Eitz Chaim that the beginning, meaning not in time but conceptually, in order for existence to come into place, God had to conceal complete darkness, the infinite Ein Sof that emanated from the divine essence. God concealed it all. And what did he leave? A perfect black circle. That's what it says in Eitz Chaim. And this is a few hundred years before Einstein, before black holes. A perfect black circle. He calls it a cholol or mokum pani, meaning a hole and an empty space, and makes clear it's a circle, not a square, not a triangle, a perfect circle. Obviously, it's a conceptual concept. It's not a physical concept. It's a cosmic circle. And based on the Zohar. And interestingly, if you look in the beginning of the Bible, the Torah, it says also the same thing. Essentially, in the second verse of the Torah, a cryptic verse that very few can understand altogether, it says in the beginning, everyone knows the first verse. Genesis 1:1, everyone knows. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. Bereshis bara Elokim es hashamayim v'saaretz. But then comes Genesis 1:2. Va'aretz ha'isa toyu v'voyu v'chishach al pnei ha'sahem v'ruach Elokim merachefes al pnei hamayim. That the earth was empty and void. Darkness filled the entire existence. And the Spirit of God hovered over the waters. Now, what does this mean exactly? What did it look like? What did the earth look like? Beginning God created heaven and earth. Okay, we know what heaven and earth is like. The sky, there's the earth. So of course, to understand this verse, second verse, you need Kabbalah, you need mysticism, because there's no other way of understanding. Essentially, it's alluding to the first Tzimtzum, the Tzimtzum Harishon that we call, the great concealment, the first black hole. The black hole is intense energy. But it's energy that's inverted. Instead of going out, it's going in. This is the root of the energy called grief and loss. It's a very powerful energy. As I said, most of us will experience it much more intensely than we experience light. Light is very beautiful and blessing, but when you experience the absence of light in a very intense way, it's terrifying. So, is it energy or not? It's extreme energy. Kabbalistically speaking, actually this energy is necessary for existence to be. We couldn't be if there was no such darkness. Because the light would absolutely consume us all. It would be the equivalent of trying to look at the sun without sunglasses. I mean, that's just a small example. But imagine the sun is 1,000 million times infinitely brighter than it is. What would it do? It would destroy your eyes. The same idea is that you need this lamp of darkness, this black hole, in order to existence to take place. So again, this is not a justification, because God in His mysterious ways could probably have done things, could surely have done things in many other ways. But don't ever think that darkness is not energy. It's intense energy. In many ways even more intense than the light itself. Because as it says in some places in Hasidic discourses, that the energy needed to conceal is deeper than the energy needed to reveal. And to use a small example, think of a wise person. A wise person who has something to say in a very critical situation. Is it easier for the person who's wise to say it, or to withhold, or to be quiet? Obviously, it takes a lot more effort if you have something to say, not to say it. Now, I'm specifically focusing on the word, on the emphasis here. The operative word is wise. There are a lot of people who talk a lot, they have nothing to say. That's another story. When we were in yeshiva, so our mashpia, our teacher, told us, there's an expression in Pirkei Avos that says, "Siyag l'chachma shtika." How do you translate that? Siyag, a support to chachma, or maybe a sign of chachma, is silence. So he asked us a question. So why did our sages reveal the secret of wisdom, which is silence? This way, foolish people now know the secret, and they're going to know that if they're silent, they're going to be seen also as wise. He's basically revealing a trade secret for the wise. So his answer was, in Yiddish he said, a fool can't control himself. Even if he knows the secret, he won't be able to remain silent. Because it's not about knowing. It's about just unable. A truly wise person knows how to be silent. One that's not, you can tell him that this is the secret of all wisdom. That won't help. Huh? Okay. Yeah. Well, children is a whole other story. That's if adults were not corrupt, it wouldn't be a problem for children not to reveal secrets. Maybe their secrets are not so bad. What secret can a child already, what could the child say? That's bad. That what? That I want to have a pure heart and soul and I want to play? The secrets that the children are told not to tell are adults' problems, not children's problems, unfortunately. We live lives that are duplicitous, and then we create secrets, Anyway, the point here is not about whether you can hold a secret or not. This is more about a dimension of strength and discipline. The great masters that I've been around, not that many, the ones I have witnessed, I learned much more from what they didn't say from what they did say. When you go to someone that's truly wise for advice, so yes, there will be maybe some things they say and you should listen closely, but probably things that they don't say between the lines that are probably you should listen even closer to that. Because there's some things that a wise person knows not to say. Maybe you're not ready to hear it that way. Maybe when you do the things that he does suggest or she suggests, then you yourself will come to certain realizations. Because the wise, as they say, whenever I give a class that they title Kabbalah or Advanced Kabbalah, I say that intentionally because I once gave a course in the Open Center. So they called it Introduction to Kabbalah. So whatever, 20 people came. The next time they wanted to do it, I said, call it Advanced Kabbalah. And like 60 people came. And now, trust me, I said the same thing in both of them. But Advanced Kabbalah, people don't want to hear that it's an introduction. They want the advanced thing. Even though, counterintuitively, the books called for dummies, the dummy series, did work. Even though some questioned the wisdom of that, because people don't want to be considered dummies. But I guess it was tongue-in-cheek enough that people went for it. But it was a question, Can you do this Kabbalah for dummies, or Das for dummies, or computers for dummies, What? Maybe, that's but then they see it on your shelf. But the point being that so whenever I give these classes, the first thing I always open up with, which I always love to see people's reaction, is I say, I was taught about Kabbalah that those that say don't know, and those that know don't say. So I guess whatever I say now is going to be a sign that I don't know. And then I leave it at that, and then I go into Advanced Kabbalah, and I guess everybody forgets that opening statement. And that's that. So in truth, as I said, the deepest secrets, the deepest power in life, is they say, Megala tefach, mechased fachayim. You reveal 1 inch and you conceal 2. That's a sign of real wisdom. And God, of course, does that very well, maybe often too well, and is the secret of the black hole. So grief and fires and all the distress and pain and anxiety that it brings on are all legitimate. There is anxiety when you see darkness, or when you don't see light, you see absence of light. It's not a very pleasant thing. You come to a dark room, the fact is, in the dark room you can't see where the objects are. Light doesn't change anything in the room, mind you. But it allows you to see. Here's a chair, here are steps, here's a table. If you can't see, you don't know how to use these objects. So we live in a dark world, even though the sun is shining and we have an artificial light. But we live in a dark world as far as direction in life. Who of us knows what path is the right path? So there's an interesting statement we'll read later in the book of Devarim in Kisaveh. It says, Re'ei, actually. Re'ei anechin esen l'fnechem hayem es habrocha v'es haklala. Behold, 2 weeks from now we'll read this. Behold, I will show you today the path of blessing and the path of curse. The question is asked, the word in the Torah called Neisen Lifnechem, Neisen, whenever the word Neisen is used, means to give, it refers to a gift. Kol ha-Neisen b'ma'ayin yofer Neisen. Everyone who gives it, it's a pleasant thing, it's a giving. What kind of gift is it? The gift of the path of blessing is a gift. Why? How is the path of curse a gift? And the answer is very simple. Because when you're traveling in life and someone tells you, go down this path, it's the right path for you, that's a great blessing. But if someone tells you, don't go down that path, it's a waste of time or you're going to get hurt, that's an equal blessing, maybe even a greater blessing. Because they went there. And it's helping you avoid many years of loss and pain and so on. Sometimes we have to learn it through our own trial and error. But the idea is, clarity is the blessing of life. And we live in a world where the twists and turns, and the ebb and flows, and the valleys and peaks, and everything we're talking about, are not seen. You know, what does tomorrow bring to our lives? A lot of it is unknown. Some of us are terrified of this unknown. Some of us are terrified of that phone call that we've been dreading for who knows how long. It may never come, but you still dread it. And there are people that look forward to the next day. So how do you develop an attitude where you're able to step back and understand that there is this cycle and there's this picture? So the first thing, obviously, is cognitive, what we call the cognitive life raft. It's to understand it first intellectually. Because emotionally, it's very hard. When you walk into a dark room, it's dark. And there's no way that someone can just convince you and say this is a black hole, it has even more light than the rooms that are filled with light, and that the darkness is brighter than light, and so on. But with your mind, you can begin to understand it. You can begin to understand that the cycles of life are such where there will be times where the darkness will be so intense you will think that there's no hope. But if you go in before that happens, you go in with wisdom. And Chacham Einav Bereishei, Chachmas Adam Teir Panav, the wise person's eyes are in his head, and the wisdom is a light. So wisdom shines a light in telling you that there are paths of darkness. It doesn't necessarily shine the light that you can see how to travel, but it prepares you. You know, when you will travel your paths in life, you will come to places that are black holes. You won't see anything. It'll seem hopeless, but don't think there's nothing there. It's deceptive. It's a deception. There's some very great power there. So when you fall into that hole, and I used myself as an example simply because I lived through it. I saw it. I saw the great grief, and then I saw how grief can be channeled. And there's no way I could have seen it at the time. At the time, it was like falling into the hole and not knowing how you're going to get out of it. I mean, there was a part of me, because I had studied and I had learned and I'd seen people who have suffered, and I saw how they grew through it, so I knew that it's doable. But personally, you're just in a completely surreal world. I remember the first time I walked out of my parents' house, the day after, when you stand up from Shiva, and walked up Kingston Avenue, the streets, it was like very surreal. I saw people like moving about, doing their lives. And I remembered I was one of those people. It was like looking at a film almost. And I was even thinking to myself, well, when am I going to become one of them again? Type of thing. And you're the same person. It's not like you don't know how to eat and talk to people. Everything works, but something in your psyche has seen something that maybe no person should ever see. No, you've seen a different reality. And things don't matter. And interestingly, when the curtain comes back down, as much as I remember that place, I'm now back with you here. You know, and I remember it, and I probably can regenerate it if I need be. But what did remain with me was, I never forgot it. What did remain with me was, I guess, like a soldier, you train for half your lifetime just to go into that one battle, real battle. I was trained by good people. So when I came out of it, I knew how to channel the grief. I knew how to dedicate my life. I did certain things for my father. Till this day, I commit to it. You know, I channeled it into positive things. Now, at the time, it was a complete black hole, no question about it. But today, it's energy. Today, what remains is the positive. And I've seen people before me, and I don't see this as some type of major achievement that none of you are capable of. I think all of us have that ability. But you have to have, obviously, courage, and you have to have people around you that are good models for this. You have to have very deep faith that there's no such thing as absolute darkness. A black hole is light. Einstein, maybe because he was a Jew, he believed, so he had faith. He didn't have proof. He really didn't. He theorized. He realized, based on the principles that he was coming up with, that conceptually there should be such an entity. You know? So a step further is that there's no such thing as a place devoid of energy. It may be devoid of visible light. It may be devoid of what we call blessing, revealed blessing. But to say it has no energy is absolutely wrong. It's inverted energy. I have seen people with so much pain inside of them, and you think to yourself, if you were able to just turn that pain into fuel, they could just change worlds for the positive. Instead, what it's doing is destroying them and eating them up alive. Same energy, just in the wrong direction. So you have a kettle that's boiling water, and imagine there's no spout. Where's the energy going to go? It's going to go inward till it'll destroy itself. It'll implode. The kettle, the energy that comes out through the spout, is very powerful. Much of the energy we generate today is energy from repression that's just been released. You know, you see this with wind energy. You can see it with other, bursts of energy. A volcano. Yes, of course, it can be destructive if there's people living near it. But the power that it releases, the ability to regenerate Volcanoes without volcanoes that are happening, erupting under the water, under the oceans, life would not be the way it is. It continuously regenerates new nutrients and so on, only because of the explosive power that comes as a result of so intense repression. Now, obviously, if you're in the way, God forbid, in the way of the explosion, it's destructive. But the concept of a volcano, even an earthquake, these are part of nature's ways of releasing massive amounts of energy after a lot of tension is built up. So, while you're experiencing it and you're in it, you're in the black hole, it's not pleasant. That's for sure, put it mildly. But there's a deep understanding before you entered. And once you somewhat free yourself from its tentacles, that you can redeem it. Absolutely. In that spirit, let me just say this, one of the ways I've redeemed it, in my father's case, is I committed as a mitzvah, complete mitzvah, to make sure his newspaper that he founded that has, I believe, social value and so on, should continue. So I'm here to announce, I think I put it into the email as well, one of the things we did right away was an annual lecture in honor of my father. An annual lecture about something about welfare of the Jewish people, Israel, something that is important to all of us. So I want to just ask you to all save the date, October 3rd. We'll be at the Park East Synagogue, which is at 57th in Lexington, 59th? 58th in Lexington. The exact address is in the email. We'll send you more details, October 3rd. And this year we're honored, which was an achievement, to get Senator Joseph Lieberman, who will deliver the lecture. It's actually on Hey Tishrei. It's exactly Monday night between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. So you'd honor me, save the date. It'll probably be sold out, so it was just asking our RSVP. So please do so. This wasn't meant to plug it, it was just an example. This is exactly part of how I channel my father today. Now, I believe it's also a good cause, but it's definitely driven. My father would be here today, I wouldn't be doing this. I have other things I'd be doing, but not this. I'd rather, actually, if he were here, say, have his headache, but then we wouldn't have a lecture in his memory, so I guess that would be... So the point is that all of us have the power to do so. Now, I have to qualify all this by saying that there comes a point where the dark hole, the black hole, is a very lonely journey. And it's not easy in any generic fashion to sit here and give you a general formula. At the end of the day, everything I've said here is like the first step. Then comes the next step. For each of us to take this and apply it to our particular situation. And no two situations are alike. Let me make that very clear. No two situations are alike. But I want to say one thing that I've discovered, an interesting pattern. When a person bleeds, God forbid, they think they're the only one that bleeds that way. And you discover everybody bleeds the same way. You get a cut, it bleeds, till it clots, hopefully, and then it heals. I find a lot of us who suffered, who've gone through a fire, think that our fire is different than everybody else's. It's different in certain ways. Obviously, we all have our unique life story. But remember, we all deal with fires in the same way. And one of the powers that it has, it makes you think that you're unique in your pain. And I always try to tell people, you know what, you're unique in your strengths, not in your pain. Yes, you may have had pain that other people didn't have, but don't glorify it and turning yourself saying, my indispensable story or my unique story is the losses I've endured. Because then what happens is, not only that you suffered, you also become a sufferer. You start defining your identity is defined by what you've lost. When in truth is your identity is what you are, your strengths, your powers. And the loss should be a catalyst to growth. Because once a person can't distinguish between what they've lost and them, then you're dealing with like almost an impossible situation. How can you heal when you think you're the problem? Or the problem is so much one with you that there's no way to separate them. But as they say, Rabbi Nachman said, if something can be broken, it can be fixed. It's a two-way street. If it goes one way, it can go the other way. And the interesting thing is, even if someone else broke it, not that you broke it and you can fix it, even someone else, you could also fix it. Because there's a great God, there's a great soul inside each of us, and there's no such thing as being a victim of someone else's crimes. We can be hurt by other people, and it can make your life quite difficult, but that cannot be the end story. It cannot be the end story, because God gave us a soul, and our soul can never be hurt by another person. Our bodies can be hurt, the channels that connect the soul to the body can be hurt. But the soul itself always remains an independent force that can get through anything. So to go back to the opening theme about prosperity, wealth, and fire, some of us can ask the question, why is it then people who've gone through fires haven't become wealthy afterwards? Well, it's a good question. Some have and some haven't. And I don't mean through insurance policies, that fire insurance. Well, wealth in the context of the statement made by these holy masters, obviously is not just spiritual wealth, they're talking about physical wealth. So, though I don't have a complete answer, I would submit that perhaps it goes like this. It's also our attitudes. If we remain scarred, charred by the fires, and instead of allowing it to turn into the next stage of our lives, then we remain still in stage gvura without letting it reach the Tiferes. So I would say is that within the fire was born the new channels of wealth, but there's a step. It's not just a magic pill. You have to do something about it. If you remain in the burned building, or you remain identified by that burn and the fire, the prosperity may be right there waiting, but you can't get it. An example I've given before in the past with the spiral staircase. The Baal Shem Tov calls it Schwindeltreppe. Why Schwindeltreppe? Schwindeltreppe means swindling steps. You walk up a regular staircase, you see the destination. Maybe a distant destination, but you see it. When you walk up a spiral staircase, which of course is always usually in a much smaller area, you have to go 360 degrees. You keep going around and around and around until you get to the top. So you keep turning your back to the destination to the point that you can convince yourself, I'm not even getting anywhere. I may not even be traveling. I'm actually traveling backwards, you can say to yourself. And then right before you reach the pinnacle, you have to turn your back all the way. So if fire has within it the birth of wealth, but you're still busy with the fire, the wealth is sitting there, but you're just not making your final turn. There has to be some action. And I've seen people in life who went bankrupt, or their businesses failed, or actually there was a fire in one way or another that destroyed something. Some were so demoralized and embarrassed and humiliated they just couldn't pick themselves up. And others picked themselves up, learned from it, did not give up, were fighters, and they didn't make the same mistakes next time, and they've achieved greatness. You show me a case success story, and I'll show you 3 bankruptcies or 3 failures before it at least. Now there are exceptions, obviously. There are people, they hit a home run the first time, but it's usually not the case. The biggest success ones had quite a few failures. They always talk in the publishing world, they talk about the classic story of the Chicken Soup series. The Chicken Soup for the Soul series. Chicken Soup for the Soul, if I recall correctly, was rejected by 28 publishers. Now you tell me, and you know anybody that's written a manuscript and submitted 28, I don't think anybody submits it more than 5, 6. At some point, people are going to tell you, hey, something's, be a little humble, this book is not, nobody wants it. Now, I don't even know where they got that fortitude to just keep submitting it. But I think it was 28. It was definitely in the 20s. But the bottom line is it was submitted, and finally it was accepted not even by a regular publisher, but by a publisher that no one knew. So he took a complete gamble, and that book turned the publisher into a giant, relatively speaking. This book. So it's just an example. How many times have human beings tried to fly an airplane before the Wright brothers got it right? No pun intended. How many times? Who knows? No one documented. Most people don't document their failures. We hear the success stories. I remember reading the story about, what was his name? The 2 names, Luce, and who was his partner? Hayes, in the early 20th century. So there were the major newspapers, and they decided they're going to create a news magazine. This later would become Time magazine. So I'm reading the story about a biography on Time magazine that later became Time Life, then Newsweek spinned off of that, etc. What was their idea? That instead of reading a newspaper, that at the end of the week, we will give you a summation of all the news that happened that week. That was the concept. These 2 young students, Luce was one of them, right? And you can look it up. I forgot what the other guy's name. He died earlier. But they came up with this idea. Everybody laughed them out of their rooms. They asked for us a little investment. They said, who needs such a thing? Who wants to read the news 7 days later? Now remember, there's no internet and all of that. We got our newspaper, we read the news, and the next day we got the next one. Who wants to hear a summary at the end of the week? Doesn't make any sense. Breaking news, what news, what are you going to tell us? And they weren't just talking about commentary. It was a summation of the news for the week. But these guys decided, they set their mind to it. I'm not just saying this is one example, it's one I recall. What did they do? They cut out newspapers, because there was no technologies then, and they pasted with glue this news magazine, they put it on their block, 2 blocks, they put it in everybody's mailbox. 90% of the people wanted to arrest them for littering their mailboxes, and they still didn't give up. Their families thought it was crazy, everybody thought it was crazy. But they set their mind to it, and they created an industry. Now, what was exactly in their mind going on that no one else saw? Whatever it was. But trust me, they failed many times. And this goes on and on and on. Now, you may have heard this, every motivational speaker talks about the failures that come before. What I'm trying to say here is something deeper, and that is that within the fire is the wealth. We don't see it. So we have to honor it in 2 stages. But it's there. And it's those that see it through, that actually can access it. So simply put, if God sends a fire in your life, He also sends you a bundle of wealth. I don't just mean spiritual, real wealth. And it's there. But your attitude, what you do next, how you look at it, your arrogance as well, and your humility, all factors in whether the wealth can enter. And it's not about punishment or reward, what God is waiting to see whether you're going to behave. It's about your own attitude. If you have a defeatist attitude, fatalistic one, and the fire still dominates, obviously, how can the wealth emerge? Now, sometimes that happens, but often it's not going to happen because you are blocking the blessing from manifesting. So this is a statement made. I remember my father when he wrote certain articles that some people didn't like. It's a true story. In 1978, they decided to firebomb the newspaper. So they came Tuesday morning, and the whole building, it was a small building, they basically firebombed it. Not mentioning names, but there were some people who didn't like what he was writing. My father, if you knew him, these things don't, firebomb that brought out all his great creative juices, and he went on a war path. First of all, he made sure that the newspaper was coming out by hook or by crook. He found another printer, they worked around the clock, and they had the front page was Allgemeine Journal firebombed by, and he spelled out their names, and wrote an editorial that not Hitler and not Stalin stopped us, the Jewish people, not a few, what he called, poison mice are going to stop us from giving out a newspaper in America. Anyway, my father, full glory, came, and I was 20 years old at the time, 21, 20, and it was a lesson. I saw these things. I was proud of it, and also it taught me. These are called fighters. There's no such thing as defeatism, and that's what he did in a fire. Anyway, he wrote an article. In one of the editorials, he wrote there's a saying that some people say it's a Volkswort, a folk tale. Is that an expression? Like a folk's tale that say that after fire one becomes wealthy. He wrote it that week in the paper. On Thursday he had to be in Florida, so he flew down to Florida. He gets a call from New York, calls from the Lubavitcher Rebbe, the Rebbe's secretary, would like to see him. So my father flew back. Thursday night he went to see the Rebbe, and the Rebbe said to him, I read your article about, said that there's a folk tale, that after a fire you become wealthy. I want to correct you and say it's not a folk tale, it comes from holy masters. Kadesh Eliyah. It's not just some type of what do they call a grandma, what do they call it? Old wives' tale. There you go. Very good. Old wives' tale. That it comes from Kadesh Eliyah. And he showed him where it says it. So next week my father wrote a correction. He wrote that one of our distinguished readers pointed out that it's not a old wives' tale. It actually comes from holy people. Now, the question, of course, you all want to know is my father got wealthy or not after that, right? Well, let's put it this way. He was definitely successful, and the newspaper thrived. except there were mistakes made afterwards that didn't keep it going. That's where we are now. So I'm not waiting for the fire, God forbid, but I definitely saw wealth that came out of it. I'm talking about even physical wealth. The newspaper thrived after that. There was a period in the 80s that it was really successful. But every success comes with challenges, things you have to also adjust to changes, and so on and so forth. So the point is, I saw it with my own eyes, and yes, that's what we're promised. So of course we can play the skeptic and say many people have had fires and they behaved well, and why didn't the wealth come? Look, I'm not here to explain God's mysterious ways. I do know this, that with every baggage of challenge, of pain, we're given a baggage of wealth on all levels and strengths. And the question is whether we're going to access it or not access it. And I have seen my own eyes people who have accessed it and have become extremely successful, wealthy, prosperous on many, many levels. Above all, of course, the ultimate prosperity is emotional strength. That which doesn't kill us makes us stronger. Those of us that have gone through difficulties and we allow ourselves to grow through it, we allow ourselves to be humbled, we allow ourselves to not blame ourselves or others, and we become wiser, and the wisdom and credibility that it gives us is great power to be able to help the world, help repair others, create a certain strength. There are people I will always send to certain individuals, because people who've gone through the fire and come out stronger are the best people to send people who are suffering or difficulties, because they have real credibility. They were there. So you can't say to me, people can say to me, listen, you've never been there. You never suffered like I've suffered. And it's true, I haven't. As empathetic and as compassionate a person can be, you can't say I'm in those shoes. But I've seen enough to say that there's a lot of pain, and there are people that you could go to that do have the credibility. And in a way, all of us can help heal each other. I want to conclude with one short story that happened in this Shabbos Nachamu. In those past years when we were all younger and more, adventurous,